have to push something? Perfect. Good afternoon, and welcome to the last panel of the day, now with bathroom breaks, the Digital Broadband Migration Conference. We're innovating year over year, remarkably. My name is Ray Gifford. I'm a senior adjunct fellow here at Silicon Flatirons, a partner at Wilkinson Barker, and am glad to lead this final panel of the day. I think you can read and see the bios of our august speakers, so I will not spend time introducing them. Really keying off of Howard's presentation, I think we only have one question to answer on this panel, which is, does the fact that France is concerned about the GAFAs as a matter of interconnection and competition policy, does that conclusively or only presumptively mean we shouldn't care? No, honestly, let me give you the order that we're going to go in. And I'm actually very excited to hear from these folks because they're very smart and worth listening to. First, Carl Shapiro and Babette Boliek will be giving a 10-minute presentations respectively. And then reacting to that, we'll have our perennial member of the Silicon Flatirons family, Judge Steve Williams, reacting, dismantling, criticizing, followed by Rebecca Arbogast from Comcast, and finally bringing an international flavor, among other things, to the panel, talking about the institutions around the globe and internet governance. We'll have Carlos Rodriguez Cocina from Telefonica. But with that, we will start with you, Carl.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Well, Howard already stole my thunder because I thought I could admit I don't know the answers and I just ask questions, but he already did that, and he's like, we're supposed to give the answers now, which, thanks, Howard. But it does tell you something when the regulatory czar tells you should be cautious about regulation. Okay, so we'll come back to that theme, I think. I know you're not. I know you can't call yourself a czar, but I can call yourself a czar.
I just want to wear my cool hat.
So what I thought I'd do is, look, I'm really an antitrust guy, not a telecom guy, and so I'm coming at this very much from issue. Well, and there are three terms in our title: competition policy, interconnection, and internet governance. So I'm going to talk about competition policy and interconnection, and
I'm going to talk about competition policy and internet governance, so we got it.
All right, okay, we're good. Okay, so now we've already heard today, and we're going to come back to the Verizon decision, the DC Circuit decision. You know that's kind of, it's a big thing, right? And we're going to talk about that. So I want to get there. I don't want to start there. I want to get there by first talking about antitrust principles about competition and interconnection. Talk about some other industries, actually, what we learned from. And then what does that imply for broadband providers in particular, and the type, what some of the things Howard was teeing up, and that of course are central to what the DC Circuit was addressing. In preparing for this, I have to say, when I was asked to do this, I think, I feel like I've thought about some of these things before, and I realized I went back, and it's almost exactly 4 years ago. I was at DOJ as the chief economist there, and we filed an ex parte submission with the FCC regarding something like economic issues and broadband competition. I'm most proud of it, first off, because it was great, because usually you're an economist at the DOJ, you can't put your name on the court filings, right? Because you're just an economist. But these submissions, it's not like court, it's not serious stuff, it's only regulatory stuff. So the economists can put their name on it, so my name's on it. And I'm most proud because I think it's the first filing by DOJ ever where we used the word ecosystem. Okay, so we talked about, the broadband internet ecosystem. Gene Kimmelman is laughing here because he was laughing even when I put that word in there. Phil Weiser's name is on this, and Gene Kimmelman and myself. We let Christine Varney, our boss, put her name on it too. Okay, so actually there's a lot in there about antitrust, and I think about broadband and competition that still seem pretty good to me 4 years later. So I'm gonna kind of key off of that a little bit and come back to that. Let me go through a few. So antitrust thinking before we come back to the broadband. and we're talking about dealing with bottlenecks generally, okay, and in networks in particular. Okay, well, this is not a new problem, okay, and antitrust has come a long way on this. So let me mention a few cases really quickly. I mean, probably the granddaddy case here is the Terminal Railroad case, 1912 Supreme Court decision, okay, just to give you a sense of where antitrust does and doesn't go. Okay, so it's railroads. There's one bridge over the river at St. Louis. There's dozens of railroads on each side, and they don't connect with each other. It's just this one bridge. That's okay. And nobody was talking about like going after the one bridge and making it some sort of access regime. But then they built another bridge was built, and the one bridge they merged with the second bridge. Okay, now you're getting serious antitrust issue. And then when another railroad wanted to come in, didn't like the terms, and use the ferries, which was sort of the older technology, they bought the ferries too. So they all combined. That's what brought the DOJ in. And so they imposed some access rules, which are basically equal access for other railroads who want to come in as well along with the guys who already are part of this group. So yes, there's an equal access rule, but it's only coming in the context of an obviously anti-competitive horizontal combination by a bunch of existing players that's being used to exclude others. Okay, so there's a lot of factual background there before they even get to equal access. Okay, that's 100 years ago. Aspen Ski, very suitable here in Colorado. Another case where multi-market pass on the ski. They're selling the multi-market pass. The larger group pulls out, doesn't want to do it anymore, figuring that's going to give them an advantage over the one mountain company, the other guy. Okay, so there the court said, no, you can't pull out of that because there's no efficiencies, a lot of indication of likely anti-competitive effects, and ending an existing course of dealing. And even now, the court's been viewed that as the outer limits of imposing duty to deal under antitrust. Okay. As we've seen in Trinco more recently, okay, from the Supreme Court. So there's a lot of caution about any sort of mandatory duties to deal. Okay, so that's kind of where antitrust is coming from. In fact, throwing it over like, look, we don't do that. You want to impose duties to deal on regulated price, that's for the sector-specific regulators, but be careful, right? As Howard's saying, be careful before you do that. One other example, kind of famous example, the Microsoft antitrust case was a big deal in the US circle. The DOJ did not go after Microsoft for requiring access by servers. There were workgroup servers that were trying to interconnect with Windows, and they were complaining. Microsoft was trying to basically go from desktops into low-end workgroup or workgroup servers. The Europeans went after them and required them to have an interconnection rule. The US did not. Okay, so again, pretty cautious. All right, so. Now, the fact is, antitrust, we've been dealing with this in a lot of other industries too. Obviously, I could spend more than all my time, whether it's railroads, to some extent telephony, natural gas pipelines, oil pipelines, airlines, payment systems, okay? And we're always looking for, is there significant market power? And then is there a remedy, is there some conduct that either enhances or unfairly, unfair is not the word about it, that then there's anti-competitive conduct on top of the market power. Okay, so I can't help but do that here. Okay, when we come to broadband. Okay, now if you go back and look at our filing 4 years ago, we're talking about broadband competition and therefore an investment. We had 3 policy levers we looked at to try to promote broadband competition. One was more spectrum, basically in the hope that wireless would become a better, basically higher speeds and more capable. And that's still on the table and an issue. Maybe we'll return to it here. Okay. Another was transparency, just giving sort of accurate information and letting consumers shop and so forth. And then regulation. And we were pretty cautious about regulation, and that's still where I am. The sentence to quote says, price-like regulation would be appropriate only when necessary to protect consumers from the exercise of monopoly power and where such regulation would not stifle incentives to invest in infrastructure deployment. Okay, now it is a little bit odd if you look at the FCC stuff, they go like, well, we're trying to encourage deployment, and in order to encourage deployment, we're going to regulate. How does that work exactly? How is it that the very people you want to encourage their investment, you're going to put rules on them? It's possible, but that's like not the most direct argument. Okay? Okay. Now, I'm not saying there aren't good, look, if you're controlling market, you just shouldn't confuse controlling market power versus encouraging the firm to invest, okay? Controlling market power, that's the classic antitrust goal, but we shouldn't pretend that doing that is an investment incentive. Enabling other competitors, that might spur them to invest, okay? Maybe we'll come back. We also looked at this through the Comcast NBC case, where we have put in some as part of the consent decree at DOJ, which I think is still relevant because there's actually a series of essentially net neutrality-like provisions regarding Comcast network management and operations. But it wasn't, at least from the DOJ point of view, in order to generally promote open internet. It was a remedy in a situation where Comcast was buying NBCU content, and we were therefore concerned in the way you would, classic in vertical merger, that these online video distributors, OVDs, we called them, would be dependent on Comcast for content as well as to ride over their internet access. And so we had Comcast agreed to provisions so that they would not be able to stifle or weaken that competition in ways that the merger could have made worse. Okay, so there's some major merger-specific remedies. And I think actually the provisions there, we've had some conversation earlier today about specialized services and how that relates. It wasn't me, but I mean, it's just the staff at DOJ that are really clued into this, and there's provisions about basically Comcast can't have a specialized service that's substantially composed of Comcast-affiliated content, which would be kind of potentially an end run around it. Or maybe it was Gene's clever guy, but it wasn't me. Okay, so with that limited kind of remedial goal, we crafted some stuff, but that's a very different thing than trying to reform the whole industry or structure a whole industry to have openness. Okay, so let me wrap up with some themes there. I think that broadband access is like really important, and more important in our society. Okay, which we heard a little bit about rural access. It seems to me we're actually doing pretty well. The FCC seems to want to downplay how well they're doing. It seems to me we're doing pretty well in terms of deployment, and we want to get up the actual adoption rates still. That does bring in questions about price and affordability. Okay, which price and competition. Okay, so. We said in our filings, and I still, so far as I know, it's still pretty much true, there's probably significant market power in a bunch of areas. We emphasized that services were differentiated, demand was differentiated, and there was no one-size-fits-all, but there are a lot of regions where it's one or two providers who can provide the fastest service, and then an open question about how much wireless could be, is somewhat slower. But the predicate, I think for the FCC, just as the way it would be for antitrust, would be like, is there significant market power? For what type of customers, in what areas, and then you build on that. What do we have to do about that? What can we do if that is an identified problem, and that there's some question. I mean, Judge Silberman raised questions about whether that was established by the FCC. Then what do you do about it? Can you find a set of regulations or conduct that you really want to go after? So I'll close with sort of a question, but my own view on it. What sort of standard of proof? In an antitrust case, you would show there's significant market power, then you would say the company is engaging in a particular conduct that is anti-competitive, and then we're going to stop it. At least for a conduct case, as opposed to a merger case would be more prospective. Okay, now, if you're going to regulate a whole industry, it seems to me you should say, well, look, there's significant market power. If it's a market power-based remedy, which seems to be, there's significant market power, you'd want to establish that. And then there's conduct that either one of two elements of proof. Either A, there's conduct that a significant number of players have been engaged in that we think is anti-competitive, harmful to consumers or innovation. Not competitors, consumers or innovation. We see that, we've documented that, we got to stop it. That would be one. The other would be, well, maybe technology's changed, there's clear economic incentives for people to do this stuff, and we think that's also troublesome for consumers or innovation, so we're going to prophylactically regulate it. Okay, I don't really see the FCC had either one here. Okay, they certainly didn't have a lot of the conduct, actual conduct, and the incentive story seemed to be incomplete. So they got some work to do. There you go.
So, Babette, please take it from here. I think I can sum up and say that both Howard and Carl, bringing a antitrust perspective, are not unduly exercised, at least, as it were, that we have large problems with interconnection or competition policy on the internet. So please add to the discussion.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'll add what I can. I am both, by training, a lawyer and an economist, which makes me doubly boring at cocktail parties. So I'll try and direct this a little bit more into the lawyer category to add a little diversity to the panel. I am a law professor. I've been given 10 minutes, so I'll be done about an hour and a half. But on the board, basically I want to start where Carl did not want to start, and that is looking at some of the jurisdiction issues. And I think that we've seen a lot of the theme today about and in fact, Howard, you teed this up, talking about which institutions should take which role. And then the secondary question of what kind of levers those institutions should exert for whatever kind of question we're looking at the moment. So the first thing is to sort of think about which institutions can take a role, and I'm going to put this into jurisdiction between what we've been discussing, traditional regulatory FCC regulation, as well as the antitrust authorities, both the FTC and the DOJ. I have a pretty graph. Let's get to the graph. Oh, that was my bottleneck to show you that I understand what a bottleneck is too. It's me between you and the wine and cheese. So there we go. Okay. So we've been talking about a little bit of the future. I want to get us back to sort of where we are today jurisdictionally and pose some questions in that context. And the graph that I have in the back is to give a sense of this interconnection between competition policy and internet governance to the extent that that's regulation. And that there is an interplay that we need to think about as well, this institutional interplay that I would like people to focus on. And first of all is I've tried to think about this in the way that the courts have approached it. As we know, antitrust authority is based in the Sherman Act, Clayton Act, for mergers, and the FTC also has the FTC Act, most importantly Section 5, and many consumer protections. So we have also the DOJ having the Sherman Act, obviously, and Clayton Act. And then we have the FCC with what everyone probably is alluded to as rather an outdated Communications Act, which has this silo type of regulation. Well, it's the act that we have. So in that act, this is kind of where the jurisdiction lies. You have plenary jurisdiction of the antitrust authorities to deal with what we've been hearing through the day of we are now networks rather than hierarchies. And they are particularly good at able to look at the entire marketplace, and to the extent that there are bottlenecks in various places to identify and deal with those due to that plenary jurisdiction and their focus on exactly perhaps that kind of discussion, looking for market power wherever it may lay. The FCC is slightly different, as we all know. Its jurisdiction is limited by the Communications Act, and I've tried to depict it here in both these gray and blue circles. The gray circle being where we have shared jurisdiction between the DOJ, FTC, and the FCC. And then these dark blue circles, which are much more traditionally the FCC, and in fact, to some extent, solely the FCC's power. So as many of you are aware, for example, Title II is our traditional common carrier jurisdiction, and that is definitely where the greatest strength of the FCC jurisdiction lays, although it is limited in that it has the particular mechanisms and levers that they are permitted to use under there. So it's not that they can grab any kind of remedy they want. They have to deal with the remedies and levers that are within Title II. But their jurisdiction is clear, and it is in that circle that, in fact, the FTC is expressly excluded from being And the DOJ itself is also limited by cases such as Trinco, that it is just too far in the domain of the regulator for the antitrust authority to be allowed to proceed. In addition to this, we have the spectrum licenses. This is also a clear area of FCC strength and jurisdiction, and arguably a little bit more free-flowing as far as what they can put into various licensing agreements. There is, of course, some statutory limitations to that as well, but we've seen a variety of different provisions put into those licenses under their public interest mandate. And then finally, we have merger agreements, which we have shared jurisdiction as well. And when it is a regulated industry, it comes to the desk of both the FCC, who will deal with licenses and licenses transfers, and merger approvals as to that. And you'll see that there will be some public interest put into those as well. I call this more sort of opportunistic jurisdiction in that comes only when the event happens. So it's not always going to occur. So in the context that we were talking about, we have a new country heard from, shall we say, in that this January we had the Verizon decision, which affirmatively gave an affirmative authority was found under Section 706 of the Communications Act. So I think what we're going to be talking about in the next year is what exactly are the contours of that affirmative authority and how the FCC should use it, or if it should use it at all. And I think it's a conversation that has to take place along with our antitrust people. Where 706 may fit into my very pretty circle, I didn't have time nor the skill to add another circle. But where I think it would fit is if you looked at sort of that Title I area, I think you could also put Section 706 in there as well. That combined with ancillary jurisdiction might actually be able to expand that circle a bit. So that's going to be an interesting play because, again, that means they're covering territory that might already be covered by the FTC and DOJ authorities. So you have concerns of duplicative resources, but you also have concerns about arguably differing mandates. You have the public interest mandate of the FCC, obviously, and of course the FTC and DOJ, much more concerned with actual competition policy and how it affects competition policy. And so the contours of 706, I think, are going to be very fascinating for a lot of people for some time. What we do know is that you can't do certain mechanisms, certain levers you can't do under 706 because they're too much like the ones enumerated under Title II. So you can't do Title II things unless you are going to declare something to be Title II. So I think that is the jurisdictional world that we're in. So the question is, where are we going to go? How are we going to use it? What are we going to do? Do we think that we actually need to expand it? Do we want to sit? Do we want to wait and see? Like Chairman Tom Wheeler said, we want to go perhaps more case by case. Or do we want to, forgive me, I used to work in a casino. Do we want to double down and hunker in and go to Title II all in? So these are some conversations that we've had and will continue to have. So let me just throw my hat into the ring as far as what we're talking about, and just my thought that Title II is actually not a helpful paradigm at the moment, especially given there might be some levers that can be exercised under 706 without Title II that would be helpful to the conversation. Again, going through the net neutrality that brought this all to the forefront is this question of bottlenecks. And again, there was this sort of simplistic look at that. And let's see, I have another pretty graph. That's always fun. Let's see. There you go. So it was kind of described like this, is that we have this DSL and cable, and they're creating this bottleneck, and that's problematic. You had some conversation as to whether or not we should include wireless into this, and it might look something like this if we did. And then maybe it looked like this. Maybe actually wireless was a separate market, and in fact, that's kind of what the FCC ended up thinking these things through and treated it differently. And so this is where the conversation sort of realized, and you could see, well, Title II looks a little bit natural in this environment because it just so happens that at least DSL seems familiar to us as a telecom company, and that seems like a familiar road to take in regulation. But what if the world is not so simple? What if it's really messy, like this? And that's really as far as I can go artistically. So forgive me, especially David Clark with his beautiful engineering graph. That was fantastic. But and this is a question I think we keep bringing up. In this kind of world, does it make sense, especially to hunker in and go for sort of a Title II, or should we try and look at 706 and different alternatives if that's the way to go? And I think it's problematic, and to tell you again is because just like the court has limited antitrust on certain levers like duty to deal, we have some experience with the levers that are under Title II, and they are clumsy. They are perhaps a little bit more clumsy than people realize. And I want to take a nod to my California commissioner. Where is she? Commissioner Sandoval. Back in the day, I used all NARUC data for this. So I did a look, and others have done similar pieces, looking at sort of the effects of some of the levers under Title II and whether or not they were effective. And we had this interesting time when wireless was price regulated by states in a variety of ways. And then in 1993, we had an act that changed that and preempted that. So like a good datatician, I saw a before and after, and that's good data. And looking at the different types of regulation, we could compare and contrast what worked, what didn't. And we also had entry at the same time, so we saw what Spectrum did and the gift of entry, which Carl was talking about as a possible lever to improving the environment. And not to parse out these results, but the interesting thing is you want to look at price regulation and wholesale price regulation, which comes out in sort of access theories, as having a good impact overall, arguably on consumer prices or innovation or what have you. And in the results I found, and it was consistent with others, that it didn't. And that it could be neutral. It wasn't to say it had a negative impact, but that it didn't have the kind of impact that was hoped for through the process, which is problematic if you're hesitating whether you're hitting the right goal at all. So what's the takeaway from this is our past experience. I think basically a few things is that regulation may not be able to reach its stated goal. We got to be cognizant of that. I know many have talked about identifying the harms that can happen in the marketplace, and I think that's a good thing, but I always am a little perplexed when we don't also ask what are the benefits that can be gained from intervention in a practical way. And given the levers that we have, will it benefit us and work with us? So I think that we need to think not only of the harms, but also the benefits we can look at, and think about different alternatives as we go forward in balancing the regulator and the antitrust.
Thank you, Babette. Judge Williams, you have heard caution, restraint, and caution, I think, which are always good things to hear. Could you maybe address a couple ideas, which is one, institutionally, you get to see antitrust analysis coming at you, but you've heard of it. You get to see agency a lot, and then you get to never see consent decrees, which are a third type of competition policy.
Yeah, occasionally we have.
Rarely, okay.
Assault on a consent decree.
One, I guess, do you have any reflections on those different institutional modalities? But more broadly, sitting on a court looking at these competition issues coming at you, can you add to the consensus of caution?
Yes and no. We have a lot of, as you say, regulatory cases, and a lot of them are in the field of natural monopoly. And they spring from statutes enacted, starting with the Interstate Commerce Act, I guess in 1983, more or less contemporaneous, roughly the same era as the Sherman Antitrust Act. And then we have two other statutes that we spent a lot of time on, the Federal Power Act, the Natural Gas Act. Put aside the Federal Communications Act for a moment. But the interesting thing is that in those big areas, we have genuine natural monopolies. We have, on the whole, I'm talking about electricity transmission, natural gas transmission, oil pipeline transmission, and railroads. We have, or at least had at one point, the railroads. It's obviously been changed radically since the Staggers Act, and since the economic changes that caused the Staggers Act. We had genuine natural monopoly, and I don't think anyone was ever trying to fit those industries into the antitrust model, or at least after those acts were established. So here we have an industry which doesn't look like those natural monopoly industries. I guess the question is, to what extent does it look like the industries that Congress, in adopting these statutes, evidently assumed by omission could be handled perfectly well by the antitrust. That is to say, competition could be handled perfectly well by the antitrust laws. And it seemed to me that the criteria that Carl mentioned made all kinds of sense. Asked for not merely some evidence of market power, significant market power, but also not merely anti-competitive conduct. That's what the antitrust laws are for, but anti-competitive conduct by multiple players, or alternatively, if I understood it correctly, changes that seem to call for a prophylactic rule, and he did not see any. I mean, it seems to me that those are certainly things that must be looked at if either Congress or the Commission is to make the move to full-scale regulation of the sort we associate with natural monopolies. I mean, the statute is so strangely worded, and my colleagues in the Verizon case quote the relevant section. A telecommunications carrier should be treated as a common carrier under this act only to the extent that it is engaged in providing telecommunications services. So that makes this policy issue, which all of us are sort of circling around, entirely a matter of language. Does it fit into this category of telecommunications services? However, the Supreme Court has clearly given the Commission a lot of leeway to make that decision, so it can presumably inject a lot of, for example, Carl's criteria into the process. There's another criterion that it seems to me ought to be introduced into it, although maybe the Commission would be loath to do it because it may not reflect well on the Commission. and it's an issue that's been raised more than once at this conference, and that is the extent to which sector-specific regulation invites rent seeking. You have a bunch of regulators who are accustomed to a bunch of interest groups, and they're sort of accommodating them and fitting, trying to create an agenda that will either make the most powerful interest groups happy or at least not make too many of them unhappy. And that is not the way a lot of us feel competition policy should operate. So that's at least a something that ought to be considered, you would think. I guess I want to close really by asking a couple of questions, and that is, what would a public interest analysis of the Commission's open access order, open internet order, look like? Who would be identified as the winning interest groups? Who as the losing interest groups? To what extent are divisions within what seem to be a winning interest group access providers? To what extent are there really significant divisions within that broadly defined interest group? And I guess more generally, the question, to what extent does just the history of that rule and its enactment fulfill or refute Mansur Olson's insight about the difference in ability to secure government intervention from diffuse interests as opposed to concentrated interests?
Quick follow-up question, Judge Williams. Would this internet sector broadly benefit from its own Staggers Act, which was the legislation in the early 1980s that really made the railroads largely deregulated, but with some doctrinal pockets of the captive shipper doctrine and so forth, where there would still be sector-specific scrutiny?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting analysis because it suggests that here we have, and I guess Carl was alluding to this, different geographies, different particular services and so forth. And to the extent that you have very substantial market power in specific areas, the Staggers Act that solution looks like something that would make a lot of sense.
Let me just comment, interrupt a little bit on, and you said that broadband, I guess, doesn't look like a natural monopoly like some of these other areas. I think in actually most all of them, it's a bit tricky, and I'm not sure this is straight. For example, in railroads, we did railroad mergers, and they'd be like, well, there's another line, you can put stuff there. There's waterborne in some cases, people putting a lot of cargo on water. Or you have a spur line to another. So there would be elements of competition. I think we see something similar for broadband, where you see there's areas where it's pretty clear there's no really good alternative. There's other areas where there's quite a few choices. And actually your slides suggested, a bunch of variety. But even other areas, I mean, electricity transmission.
Let me just go back to railroads. I think at the time of the adoption of the Interstate Commerce Act, it didn't look that way to Congress.
I was thinking more, a little more recently.
I understand that.
Like when the ICC was sunset and we had the surfboard instead, is we have more of this in the last 15, 20 years roughly. And again, some other sectors, there's nuances, and I think the fact that there's significant elements of competition here doesn't, to me, take away the possibility, in the likelihood that there's some significant market power as well. Right. It needs to be determined its strength and location.
Yeah. Well, that counts for my relatively positive response to Ray's
Yes, no, I think we're converging or something.
I just, if there's an opening to talk about the Staggers Act, I'm going to take
Always
it.
take it.
Rebecca, let's switch gears a little bit, and I think maybe both you and Carlos can help this transition. One of the things we've not yet talked a lot about is internet governance. And the international aspects to this and the comparative aspects of this, and not forcing you into talking about anything specific, but suggesting you maybe help lead us toward that discussion. Could you maybe direct your comments toward those internet governance and those comparative issues that we want to talk about?
Sure, and I have to say I'm still having a bit of a bad flashback from having Kevin resurrect ONA. With Anna Gomez at the time, I remember Ari Fitzgerald and I were going around meeting with all the newly formed regulators after the WTO agreement, and we'd have to find Don Stockdale, wherever he was, in the building, have him teach us, again, computer 1, computer 2, computer 3, rehearse it enough to go talk to the regulators, and then completely forget what it meant. So my comments are mostly by way of a story, I think, which is both looking ahead to internet governance and then picking up, I think, on some of the themes that Carl and Judge Williams and Babette said. It's more of a parable, I guess, less of a myth. And unfortunately, it's a story with a lot of numbers and no pictures. I'm sorry. So I remember being in graduate school when I was studying communications policy before I went to law school, and thinking that it's a shame that the government, that the policymakers can't run experiments, run policy experiments. So you've got a problem you're trying to solve. Everybody gets together and figures out the best answer they can get together. They try it. They try it for a period of time. They look and see how it worked out. And then if they didn't work out well, you go adjust, you do something else, and you run your policy that way. It still sort of appeals to me, but I grew up and I realized that you can't just run experiments, because the problem is, particularly in sectors like this, if you go down a particular road, oftentimes you can't then hit the rewind button and come back. It's just impossible. Or probably more commonly, it's just very hard and disruptive and expensive to do that. So I love it that we've actually got a natural experiment that's going on in internet governance. We've got the US took one path, the EU took another path, and Australia's taken another path. Now you can quibble about some of the details of the story I've got, but directionally I think it's right. So the US, we went through a period of very heavy regulation with the telco service, which was when Ari and I were going around and trying to spread the gospel to other countries. But when it shifted over to broadband, the government took a different path. It took a period of time, but basically throughout the internet ecosystem, including broadband networks, it decided to be very minimalist in terms of ex-ante regulation, rely more on antitrust as a backstop. So the US, as a general matter, didn't impose rate regulation, wholesale access obligations, except in a few situations, or other regimes that were traditionally applied to the telecom services. A similar approach was set out with the notion of open internet or net neutrality, and so I'm surprised that this is the 10th anniversary of Michael Powell giving a speech here, I think. I'll ask Bill if that's right, where he outlined his 4 freedoms, which became the foundation of what we call net neutrality. They weren't regulations, famously they weren't regulations, but they were a set of guidelines on what policymakers expected from ISPs. So the EU took a very different path. It took the same general approach it was doing in telecom, which was modeled a lot after what we were doing with unbundling and so forth. And then they moved to apply that very aggressive regime over to the broadband providers, the companies that were providing telecommunication services, but also moving into DSL. They imposed really aggressive ex-ante regulation, unbundling, mandated wholesale access, retail rate regulation, and reference interconnect offers. So that's the path that they've been on up until pretty much now. Then Australia, I wish I had a map, because then I could light up Australia. After implementing a model that was largely similar to what the EU did, Australia decided in 2009 that the only way to get advanced networks deployed was for the government to do it. So they announced a plan that they were going to pay the telcos to decommission their copper networks, and then the government's going to build a monopoly, national monopoly fiber to the premises network. So that's my national experiment. The different governance approaches led to different outcomes. In the US, the broadband providers, over time, as they were freed from a lot of the regulation, invested well over $1 trillion in the largely unregulated broadband networks. So even during the recent recession, broadband providers still were investing $250 billion into their networks. The Progressive Policy Institute, their economists issue what they call an Investment Heroes Report, and 3 of the top 10 companies that were investing in U.S. capital investment were broadband providers. So that's the investment result in the U.S. In the EU, there was an initial explosion of resale-based competitors in the EU that were offering low retail rates. And so there's a lot of comparative work looking at what the services are and what the prices are in different countries. They really did, their system did a good job of wringing out a lot from the copper network. So they have pretty low prices and pretty decent coverage for the services that they were able to come out from the traditional telcos. But the problem they're having is that the retail competition model and the price regulation that went along with that just hugely now famously suppressed investment. And you see the impact of the policies. There's an increasing investment gap between the US and the EU in the sector. The OECD estimated that in 2011, the US per capita, not absolute, but the US per capita investment in telecom and broadband networks was more than 50% higher than in the EU. I met with France regulators about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. They came through and they were talking about how concerned they were about the state of broadband in their country, but their plan was, in a perfectly French way, was that they were going to fund the build out of the network to be able to catch up with the US, and they all use the terms catch up with the US. The problem that they face is in the EU, because of general economic situations, they decided last year that they were going to cut public, this is EU-wide, they're going to cut broadband public funds by 88%. So the public funding is not going to be available to help them make that up. So the different policy choices led to different investment outcomes, and that in turn, not surprisingly, led to different impact on the services. On speed, which everybody focuses on a lot, the 85% of US households have access to networks that are capable of speeds of 100 megabits per second or more. In the EU, a little over half of the households can get broadband services of 30 megabits or more. On affordability, and I want to just pause for a second on the adoption issue, the US has OECD's most affordable entry-level wired broadband, which is a critical factor for adoption. And all of the reputable studies that come out, Pew and others, when they're looking at what is keeping people, this goes to Danny's point, what's keeping people from adopting that 30% you were talking, you get different results depending on the study, but it's 9 to 15% of people say that ISP price was even a factor. The huge factor is people just don't think it's relevant to their lives. And I would push back just a little bit on what you said in terms of there's no pattern to the people that are adopting. There is. They're largely poor people and uneducated people. So households that have just a constellation of hurdles to kind of get connected with a larger economy. So on choice, which goes to competition, facilities-based competition, the US has the OECD's third highest rate of choice across the different wired broadband technologies. And on wireless, more than 95% of Americans have access to LTE, and only a quarter of Europeans have access to LTE. Finally, and I think to me more importantly, every year that goes by, I think all those policy choices, the investments, the service, then had a real impact on jobs creation, general economic development. So it's no accident that all the wonderful companies that France hates grew out of the US. There was a lot, can't claim all of it, there's a lot of entrepreneurship, access to capital, stable legal system, all that, but it required that foundation of strong broadband networks to be able to do that. And in the US, our jobs that are in the sector keep on going up, and in the EU, the jobs in the sector keep on declining. So Australia, my final experiment, they've had a rocky start. Last year, the target rollout was cut by about a third, and some analysts think it'll take maybe between 5 to 10 years longer. Their plan, their target was to get 93% of premises of households to have fiber to the premises by 2020, I think, 2020 or 2021. The remaining 7% were going to be served by satellite service. So they're now thinking it may take an additional 10 years. Big cost overruns. They don't know yet how much that's going to be. And then there was a change of government in Australia last year, and the new government decided to undertake a comprehensive review of the program. And the current prediction is that they may move away from fiber to the premises model to reduce the burden on the taxpayer budget and do something more modest. So we'll continue to see how that experiment plays out. So in closing, that's my story. Every question you ask me, Ray, I'm going to answer it with this story because I like the parable. The last thing I want to say is Babette wrote a piece, I can't remember where I saw it, but something that was looking at type 1 and type 2 errors, and that is a guide to policy with type, I vaguely remember this from graduate school, type 1 errors being you see something there that's not really there. So in this case, you see some anti-competitive activity that you then squash. Type 2 errors being you miss the signal. And here it would be you let some company do something anti-competitive and you don't stop them. I think the key challenge for us as policymakers, people who are participating in the policy discussion, is to keep on asking, how do we get that sweet spot of minimizing both the type 1 and the type 2 errors?
Thank you, Rebecca. Carlos, first of all, to be clear, my xenophobia only extends to France. I love Spain, but with Howard on the panel, a noted Francophile, I just wanted to get that in. But Telefonica is...
for you.
Telefonica is all over Europe, it's in Latin America. You face different competition policy regimes across the globe, different governance structures across the globe. From a comparative standpoint, here in the US, we tend to believe we do it more right than wrong. But from your perch in Brussels and with Telefonica across the globe, could you offer those reflections?
Yes. First of all, I would like to thank Phil for the opportunity of being here and offer these remarks. And I would like to reflect a little bit on the situation on competition policy in Europe. Actually, for Telefonica and for telco operators right now, the name of the game is consolidation, which is actually something that may be familiar for you as well here, as we are, as Telefonica, involved in processes now to sell our operation in Ireland, for instance, and acquire the subsidiary of KPN in Germany, which would mean a move from 4 to 3 operators in that market. But why consolidation is so important? Well, there is a situation in Europe of extreme market fragmentation, and this is coming from the regulatory paradigm that was applied in the 90s, at the end of the 90s, for the liberalization of the markets, when the idea was to break up the monopolies and introduce as many players as possible and have low prices for consumers and more choice. So the problem, as we see it, is that this is pretty much the paradigm that still applies today. As Rebecca was saying, with very, very stringent wholesale access regulation, illuminating basically the framework, the regulatory framework in Europe, and we think that this is not actually fit for purpose in the current situation where we need to invest heavily in LTE and fiber networks. So it's actually not a rosy picture for telco operators. Revenues have been declining steadily in Europe for the last 5 years, 2% pretty much on average. So it's kind of difficult, and we are looking at the need for scale and the need to find out a healthier situation that would allow us to cope with these investment needs. So.
Is there any consensus emerging that there's a need to weaken the wholesale access requirements in the EU?
Well, the way we look at it, we're trying to make our case for a broader understanding of the value chain, and we try to make policymakers understand that we are not competing just with telco operators or cable operators anymore. We have over-the-top players that are providing some of the same services that we do, and that actually have been an important factor in this revenue-based erosion in voice services and in SMS. So we're trying to make that point on the debates around definition of relevant markets, for instance, and others, but it's difficult. I think this is more of a vision for the long term, because it seems that that is difficult to factor in this new level of competition and what it means in terms of the impact on operators. But for the consolidation discussion, what we see now is the struggle with DG COMP, with the competition authority in the EU, to defend the dynamic efficiencies that we see coming out of this process in terms of investment in networks, in terms of higher quality services for our consumers. They still see things very much from the perspective of pricing and what this would mean for consumers in terms of potentially higher prices if the market reduces the number of players. So this is where we are at the moment. We are trying to get clearance for these two processes, defending what we see as the dynamic efficiencies and as the consumer welfare that will come out of these processes. So in the net neutrality area, we are also in the middle of a regulatory process right now. there is this initiative that was put forward by Commissioner Cruz. It's called the Digital Single Market Regulation, basically to try to create a pan-European market. And there are all sorts of elements in there. You have spectrum, you have roaming, you have access regulation, and you have net neutrality provisions as well. And actually, what she was trying to do out of this proposal was to compensate somehow telco operators, eliminating some of the traditional source of revenue, such as roaming, and giving them the opportunity to find new business models in other areas. So therefore, the provisions on net neutrality are very much looking into flexibility, commercial flexibility, the notion of the double-sided market, the possibility to introduce a segmented offer to your retail customers with data caps with different speeds, but also the possibility of offering at the wholesale level differentiated quality of service and enhanced quality of service potentially for content providers. So we were not in favor originally of any sort of regulatory approach to net neutrality, but because of the different initiatives that were taking place at the national level, and because of this approach on commercial flexibility, we thought that actually was not so bad, because otherwise...
And EU-wide net neutrality is preferable.
This would be a regulation that would apply directly in all the member states, versus what we were having until now, which was one piece of legislation in Holland, another one in Slovenia, France thinking about doing something. So this was starting to be sort of a nightmare scenario for telco operators. So the problem is that this was how the proposal was conceived by the Commission. Now it's under discussion in the European Parliament, and the European Parliament is facing a situation right before the elections, where members of the European Parliament are looking, obviously, to be re-elected, and are taking the debate not that much from the rational, technical discussion, but more from what will get them the more votes, the more possible votes, and ensure their re-election. And in that sense, you know very well that this is a very passionate and ideological debate, and they are feeling the pressure of some groups that say that, well, you need to preserve the neutrality of the internet and make sure that you do not give the opportunity for discrimination happening across the board. So we don't know how this is going to end, but we feel that the commercial flexibility that the European Commission was putting forward will be somehow limited in the discussion in the Parliament, and we're scared about that. But both issues, competition and net neutrality, and moving into the internet governance, the way we see them, have an interesting component in this idea of broadening the perspective of the value chain and taking into consideration the position of different players across the value chain. Because what we see is that traditionally the net neutrality debate has been concentrating on the access layer, and right now there are positions of dominance happening in other parts of the value chain, which actually may be hampering the opportunity for users to access content of their choice or use information and services of their choice. And we always give the example of operating systems and the fact that some of our users, when they are using a Samsung device and they want to move into an iPhone or vice versa, find out that they cannot take their applications and the music that they have downloaded and paid for to the other device. So there are issues of interoperability that actually have an impact as well in a broader concept of openness. So this is somehow the direction where we would like to take the debate. Less focus on net neutrality per se, and more focus on openness as a concept across the value chain. And the way this is being configured in terms of terminology, because there is always a new term for all this discussion, is the level playing field, is the way it's called now in Europe, level playing field between operators and OTTs. The risk about this notion of the level playing field is that some players think that this should mean applying sector-specific regulation into the over-the-top providers. The way Telefónica sees this is different. I mean, we like to think about the level playing field as a way to eliminate regulatory pressure on ourselves, so that we are able to compete with the OTTs on equal footing, let's say. And we like to talk about same services, same rules, and not that much about this idea of extending regulation to other players. So this is some of the new concepts, let's say, that we want to bring also into the debate on internet governance. I think that on the, let's say, overall process and the notion of the multi-stakeholder dialogue, there is consensus now in Europe, and there is just some concern about the opportunity to have your voice being heard more and have more opportunity for participation. But on the specific issues to deal with on the internet governance debate, there is still something to do, and this issue of the broader perspective of the value chain and the notion of same services, same rules are ideas that we would like to bring into the table.
Great. Phil Weiser has ordered an audible because there's a disturbing degree of unanimity on this panel. Therefore, he asked Barbara Van Schreich to give a 5-minute dissent from the consensus that we've had so far.
Yeah, so thanks, Phil, for giving me an opportunity to talk, and it was a real pleasure to listen to all of you. The first thing I wanted to say, if you listen to the panel, you might think, who in their right might come up with this idea of adopting network neutrality rules? And so the first really key thing that you need to understand is that everybody on the panel was implicitly or explicitly using an antitrust approach to thinking about these issues. And one of the first things the FCC says when you open up the Open Internet Order, they say, we are not actually using an antitrust approach to network neutrality. And the reason is that even though antitrust law is very, very important, it has a very narrow goal, and especially in the way it's conceived in the US. It has the limited goal of protecting competition, and in the way this has sort of played out in vertical discriminatory cases, it is quite narrow what kind of cases of discrimination an antitrust person would be concerned about. And so I'm not surprised that Carl looks at an antitrust model and says, I'm not really sure what they are thinking about. But what the FCC is concerned about is something that's a lot broader than just protecting competition. They are concerned about protecting innovation. If your application does not get to its users, and even if the market isn't monopolized, if you can't get to, let's say, 25% of your users, you make a lot less profits, and so you'll innovate less. Or the users in the 25% of the market that are being blocked will not be able to use the applications of their choice, and that can be harmful in many ways. There are arguments about free speech, that if a provider excludes certain applications, whether it's for competition-based reasons or because it doesn't like the content, then users, Derek talked about listeners' rights, won't be able to get access to all the contents that are out there. And so that's just, a very, very brief way of saying the goals of the regulation are a lot broader, and as a result, the threshold of when you might want to intervene is lower and different than what an antitrust entity might do. So if you want to, I can talk more about that, but I wanted to give you sort of the positive story that's behind the Open Internet Order. And the general story here is that with technology that has emerged over the past 10 years, the ISPs have technology that allows them to see what is going on their network and then to interfere with the applications and content. That might take the form of blocking, in which case you can't use the application at all. It might take the form of discrimination, where somehow some applications function better than others. Or it might take the form of certain forms of pricing, where you might charge differently for certain applications. I mean, in Europe, sometimes you pay a different price just for the right to be able to use internet telephony. Whereas here, we're used to just paying the same quality and bandwidth adjusted price for all applications. So that's something that's also within the broad scope of what you could do. Or you could charge application and content providers either for access to your users or for some form of preferential access, which might include not being charged against the bandwidth cap or getting some form of better treatment. And at least with blocking and discrimination, the big concern is that if network providers engage in this kind of conduct, then application providers won't get to their users, they will have trouble getting funding, and users will be harmed because first, they can't use all the applications that are out there, but even more so, they are harmed because there will be less exciting new applications in the future. So that's sort of the theoretical case. And, Carl says, well, we might probably debate about the theory here, and I've written a long book about the theoretical incentives, but I think what's a lot more interesting, that after more than 10 years of debate, we also actually have a lot of data. And here in the US, we tend to focus on the instances of discrimination that have happened in the US. And there was some, but not that many. I would say that's not that surprising because since 2005, we have lived in an environment where the regulator has said very clearly, we think users should have a right to use the applications of their choice. And even though they explicitly didn't adopt a regulation at the time, Powell said very clearly, if you violate these principles, we go after you. And when Comcast did violate the principles, the FCC went after them. So everybody here was under the very strong impression that you better not engage in lots of discrimination because it might have regulatory repercussions and sort of add fuel to the fire. If you look outside of the US, the picture is very different. And Europe is really the prime example because Europe has said, for all the reasons that Rebecca described, because we have competition in internet services, we don't really need network neutrality. And the only thing they decided to adopt were some disclosure rules that said, if you feel you want to discriminate, you need to tell your users. And the idea was that once these rules are adopted, then network providers will disclose, and then if you don't like the discrimination that's going on, you can switch providers, and ultimately that will discipline providers and prevent them from engaging in discrimination. Well, last summer in May, the group of European regulators called BEREC published the results of a survey, and they were very depressing. Basically, in most countries in the US, users are subject to discriminatory, in Europe, to discriminatory network management, which means that certain applications are singled out for special treatment to deal with congestion. There are strong restrictions on wireless networks, on whether you can use internet telephony. In some countries, on providers, you can't use them at all. In other countries, you have to pay for the right to use Skype on your cell phone, and you don't have to pay Skype. You pay your ISP, so here you would pay AT&T just for the right to use Skype. And the data is a little bit messy, but overall they say up to 95% of the users in a country can be subject to these discriminatory methods. And that's part of what added fuel to the fire and which is responsible for the fact that now people in Europe actually think that they do have a problem and that competition doesn't solve the problem. If you look to Canada, Canada had discriminatory network management. It was rampant until the Canadian regulatory agency adopted rules that forced providers to engage in application-agnostic bandwidth management, which means you can do things to manage bandwidth on your network, but you need to do it in a way that does not distinguish among the applications. Europe just adopted something like that too. The Open Internet Order had these kinds of rules. So, and if you look at what happened in wireless after the FCC adopted the Open Internet Order and said, we don't really need that many restrictions on wireless, at least right now, we want to wait and see what happened. They didn't have to wait very long. Verizon started interfering with tethering applications. AT&T didn't allow FaceTime on all of its networks. AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile did not allow Google Wallet on the network. And so even though that's now 2 years ago, Google Wallet is still not usable on these 3 networks. And so that is to say that by now we have a lot of evidence of discriminatory conduct. We call out for evidence of a harmful impact on innovation. As part of the Open Internet proceeding, a couple of small companies came forward and said, when we talk with venture capitalists, they are concerned that we might be discriminated against, and it's one of the top reasons why we don't get venture capital funding. Venture capitalists like Fred Wilson or Brett Burnham have come forward and said, that's a real issue for investors who invest in these services. And so we do have sort of reliable evidence of companies saying, we don't get funding today because of concerns about discrimination tomorrow.
So let me ask.
just
Okay.
wrap up.
Yes.
So the final thing I wanted to say was about Howard saying, well, things have changed so much since the 2000s when we started having the debate. And I would just suggest that the changes you point out either are irrelevant to the problem we are looking at, if we focus on the network neutrality problem, in that the diversification of commercial relationships is basically a diversification of interconnection relationships. But it hasn't really changed how an access service provider interacts with the applications on its network. And that's what we are concerned about with network neutrality, and we can discuss more. The things about being on both sides of the negotiating table, how that might affect what happens. I recently talked to someone who is affiliated with a network provider and has a video application, and they said, that was one of the major reasons for being affiliated, that they felt they would be screwed in the future if they weren't affiliated with a network provider, and that they see that sort of because all the big network providers have a video interest, they negotiate with each other to help their video function smoothly. But that wouldn't apply to an unaffiliated video provider because that doesn't have the negotiating power of the network provider behind them. I don't know whether that was just an anecdote that this person was saying, but it sort of throws doubt on your argument that when you are on both sides of the table, you view it differently. Final point, the question whether market power by Google, Apple, Facebook might sort of offset our concerns about discrimination. And to me, the Google Wallet story really has sort of brought more clarity to this issue. A lot of people thought that a company like Google doesn't need to worry about discrimination because it's so powerful. It might actually be able to say, well, if you block us, we want money from you, or we'll mobilize our users. And Google Wallet, as I said, was the first to market with a mobile payment application. Is still not on the mobile networks today, and the main reason, at least that's what industry analysts think, is that these three network providers have their competing mobile payment application in the ISIS consortium, and that they wanted to make sure that that application came to market first. And being powerful and having lots of market power didn't help Google at all.
So Carl and Howard, maybe jump in here too. Is antitrust too narrow of a lens, as Barbara just claimed?
Well, let me go first, and
But, yeah.
others. So Phil, thank you for calling an audible. I think it's only fair for me to say I'm pretty sure I'm the one who fumbled the ball that led to the audible. Okay. It occurred to me we've got. I've looked on the different panelists for today and tomorrow, and we've got from the FCC we've got a chair and general counsel. From the FTC we've got a chair, commissioner, general counsel, and Howard is an honorary. And DOJ, it's like, well, Phil's, ex-DOJ. Nobody currently. So I was putting on my DOJ hat, which is sort of cautious, let's say. We're law enforcement, it's just antitrust. And antitrust has clearly been trimmed back by the Supreme Court in the U.S. pretty significantly over the past 20 years or so. So in that sense, it is narrow, but one could say disciplined. Okay. So first off, you mentioned free speech issues. Okay, you're absolutely right. I'm not addressing free speech issues. That's interesting to me, okay? And I said at the end, I think broadband access is just very important socially. So let me just say, I'm not going there. And then you said, this isn't just about protecting competition, it's about protecting innovation. Okay. The main way to promote innovation is, I would say, to promote competition, since we certainly no one person knows where the innovation is supposed to go. So that's, I think, diversity. So there I would just, let's say, game on that one, okay? Let's talk about the evidence. And I'm really glad that you had the opportunity to bring up more of this evidence. Some of this, I'm like, okay, 2 people said they might not get funding because, that doesn't convince me very much, okay? But if there's a lot more evidence, that's exactly what I'm calling for. And, I don't know how much is out there. I don't claim to know that. That's exactly what I think the debate should be about. But I have to say discrimination that's based on heavy bandwidth use and congestion, I'm not sure I even call that discrimination as an economist. You got the affiliated versus unaffiliated content. That's right antitrust land, actually. Antitrust not too narrow for that. So This is the debate I think we need to have and hopefully will continue to have.
Howard?
Let me raise a couple of quick points. First of all, your example of Comcast is a great example for antitrust, not for regulation. Sorry. Is that better?
I need to bring it closer.
Okay. Your example about the Comcast case was a great example for antitrust. That was a targeted investigation based on a specific example of perceived anti-competitive conduct. If you ask me, that's not a good supporting case for regulation. It's in fact just the opposite. Innovation, I have to echo what Carl said. Interestingly, the examples that you raised of venture capitalists who said they might not fund applications, that was not aimed at underlying networks, access networks. That was aimed at Google. And the view that Google was in fact discriminating in their rankings against certain applications. No, I mean, I know this. I saw the evidence. I spoke to the venture capitalists. That's who it was aimed at. It was not aimed at underlying networks. But here's really
about different evidence. I mean, as part of the Open Internet proceeding, Brad Burnham and Fred Wilson submitted stuff specifically talking about networks, not talking about Google search engines.
Okay. But most of those complaints from the venture capitalists have been towards other layers. So that would suggest that network neutrality is then not going to solve your problem. So let me also just say something else. None of this is all on one side or all on the other, Barbara. And I do think the changes, even if they don't resolve everything and every possible problem and every discrimination, have to be thought of shifting the balance of costs and benefits between having a network neutrality regulation or not. When you have a network neutrality regulation, you are going to prevent certain things from happening. It's implicit, or in fact explicit in the remarks that you made, that there are going to be inabilities in your strong view of network neutrality to manage traffic in a discriminatory way to deal with congestion. There is going to be a limit on the ability to have any kind of pricing scheme that might allow consumer preferences to be reflected in relative prioritization of traffic. These are things that are highly efficient and that happen in normal markets. We give them up in the strong view of network neutrality because there is perceived to be this enormous benefit out there for innovation, for more applications. But it's worth recognizing in every market, in every industry, there are firms that can't get to market. There are firms that fail. They can't get distribution. They can't get to customers. They're just not good enough or well capitalized enough. They may have the best thing, and that's just what happens in markets. So it may be the case that there is this one independent video provider who cannot get through despite the shifting commercial relationships. That's a cost, to be sure. But when you use that as a basis for network neutrality, I think it's worth thinking very, very hard about the costs on the other side. And that's where you have to think about the diversity of infrastructure, the diversity of commercial relationships, the changes that have occurred, not in fully resolving all possibility that somebody might be discriminated against or not get to market, but in shifting how we think about the relative costs and benefits of a strict neutrality rule versus allowing the market to function and be more reflective. And I think if one doesn't adjust the thinking, the case for regulation falls apart. Because one final point on dynamic efficiency and innovation. The data that Rebecca brought to bear, which actually is good data, it's not advocacy data, about the growth in broadband investment here and the real decline in broadband infrastructure investment in Europe, which is creating huge problems on the application front there because there's a lot of concern that we can innovate, we can build this stuff, but there's not the infrastructure to get it to the end users. You need to think about the interplay of network neutrality regulation with that infrastructure investment because that may have a far more first-order effect on the kind of innovation and dynamic efficiency that you're concerned about than possible discrimination, which by your own admission hasn't happened much.
Now, Barbara, I absolutely want you to respond, but if we don't get to questions, I'm going to be in big trouble. So as quickly as possible, and now the students have to start thinking they have questions. They have an advance warning.
Yeah, so two things. One, I totally understand why as an antitrust person you would say just singling out a specific application for network management purposes is not a problem from an antitrust perspective. And so it's a really great test case to figure out whether it's worth doing something different in network neutrality. And so the overall idea here is that, from the perspective of the innovator, it's totally irrelevant whether you are excluded or slower on the network because the network provider doesn't like you, it wants to drive you from the market because it competes with you, or whether it's managing its network. The impact on users and application providers is exactly the same. And so the question is, and that ties into Howard's point, we are having sort of a totally abbreviated discussion here. And if you look at what the Open Internet Order said and what my writing says, you see that it's a lot more nuanced, and that both the FCC and me have put a lot of thoughts into how you can allow the network to evolve without and still protect innovators and application providers and users. And there, I just want to give two examples. One,
Quick
the order
examples.
explicitly allows different classes of service for different people. They allow different charging for that as long as it's the user that demands or requests that service and pays for that service. And so the kind of sort of what Howard was hoping for, that's actually possible under the Open Internet Orders. Users can express their demand for a higher priority service, and they can pay for it more, and you can get that. That's explicitly in the Open Internet Order. That's explicitly in my writing. Application agnostic network management allows all sorts of forms of discriminatory network management as long as it's not based on the application. And, because you don't want me to continue, but I could give you examples of that. So there is actually, a lot of people like to use this sort of Strawman picture of network neutrality that forces you to treat every packet the same. That's not the reality of the Open Internet Order, and that is not the reality of the general consensus among network neutrality.
No, and Barbara, please, it's not that I don't want you to continue, but Phil Weiser's buying us all beer. And that doesn't happen very often.
Ray, could I just make a 30-second response since my company's been cited? So I guess 2 or 3 points. One is, in the court's opinion, I think Judge Silberman made the point that after all the years of all the talk over this, there were 4 instances of problems. And I think in all or most of those cases, they were remediated as soon as it came to light. 4 out of like a gazillion exchanges that went on. First point. Second point.
Gazillion being the technical.
Yeah, because I'm an economist. Yeah. The second point is, I just think it's hard to look in a fair way at the overall industry and say that our applications, our contents, our startup companies aren't just absolutely thriving. And then the third point, probably the most important point, is I think that one of the things that's changed since Bill Kennard made that comment that Howard cited in 1998 is I think that there has been an incredible polarization, almost a religious war on this issue that's just completely unhelpful. One of the things that Bill said, Ambassador Kennard said when PPI, Progressive Policy Institute, had an event last month recognizing the digital pioneers, which started with him, Ira Magaziner, Bill, Michael Powell, and others, was he remembered at the time they were developing these rules how everybody was really working together to try to come up with the best answers. And then he flashed forward to 2008 when he said that when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama had to go to what he called a Netroots meeting and profess their fealty to pushing for net neutrality and regulation, he thought that that was a really bad sign because it indicated it was becoming a political issue and left a lot less room for people to figure out what was the sensible answer.
Questions very quickly from students. And since I can't find students, I will call on the dean to call on a student if you don't come forward.
Ray, I actually have a question.
Ah, excellent, John.
This question. Rebecca, I find the comparative case study really interesting of the 3 markets for broadband penetration. I wonder if you can talk about, or any of the other panelists, what were the different starting points there? And are there other factors like geography or culture which could have also played a role in speeding the U.S.'s comparative advantage there?
And if Carlos could also weigh in on this, I think it would be helpful.
You can start.
Part of the response lays on actually several factors. The regulatory approach, I think, is one of them. The fact that in Europe we are stuck to this idea of bundling wholesale access regulation as the perfect model to have as many competitors as possible, potentially with the idea that this would foster investment and innovation as well, has proven throughout the years not true at the end. So basically now we see a situation where in terms, for instance, of LTE deployment, Europe is lagging behind the US to a great extent. And we feel that in the US the decisions that were made at some point to abandon some of these regulatory policies that were based on access regulation to the incumbent premises led to a situation of investment that allowed them first to deploy more fiber and now concentrate more on LTE. So the regulatory approach has certainly a factor to play in this.
So real quick, it's a good and a fair question, and the couple factors that come to mind actually cut the other way, which is the U.S. has, Rob Atkinson has done a good study at ITIF looking at all the different factors, but one thing is the U.S. has low urbanicity, and so it's actually much harder to deploy in the U.S. than it is in Europe, which has much higher population concentration.
Yes.
My name is Alex Krylan with the Interdisciplinary Telecom Program. I know this is primarily a session around economics, but there's been very little conversation about actual technology and networks and the way that they're implemented. And I'm very concerned about the kind of almost monolithic approach that's taken between the extraction of a circuit switch network and overlaying that on top of potentially IP switch networks and what that might mean for interconnection and governance. And I'm curious whether or not the extent to which the deployment of software-defined networking, MPLS, LTE with priority access has a differentiating effect on comments that we might have made, kind of overlaying the circuit switch topology on top of an IP switch network. I'd be really interested to hear comments that might address that.
We're just lawyers and economists up here.
That's an extremely difficult question to answer right before people are trying to go get drinks. I would just say I look for everything to, as much as possible, to be technology neutral.
Anybody else? Final question. Frank.
I would ask, and you looked at Europe, you looked at Australia, what about Korea, which has a wide access? Is there any parallel to that, and there might be some model to look at?
Korea has extremely high urbanicity, and they have had tradition. I know this from dealing with the Korean regulators when I was in the government. They just have a lot of public funding going into their systems that we don't.
With that, I want to thank our panel. I want to thank our audience.
So, two quick things. First, Carl, you didn't drop any pass. You were awesome as always. Barbara, thank you so much for an audible. The rule is, again, please, professionals here, seek out the students. Talk to them over a beer. We really appreciate it. Thank you all so much for coming. We'll see you tomorrow, starting with our fireside chat with Chairwoman Ramirez at 9 a.m.